soy un hombre sincero, el hombre que se la palma. Yo soy un hombre sincero, el hombre que se la palma. Y antes de morir, yo quiero cantar mis versos de la última rosa blanca en junio o en enero. Último una rosa blanca en junio o en enero. Para el amigo sincero que me da su mano franca.
Well, I leave some technical proficiency to be desired here on my recordings, but hopefully you'll have fun with me as we go through this. Today we're going to be talking about a different discipline in Latin America, the international relations, and this is taken from a book, Peter, and I can't remember the last name at the moment. I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, but it's the Talons of the Eagle. Talons of the Eagle. There's a reading uploaded in Canvas that you'll be reading to cover a chapter that he writes about international relations between Latin America and the United States. So let us jump into his material. And I'm using my favorite map, the upside down map of Latin America. And here we go. So, Jose Marti said, I have lived inside the monster and I know its entrails, and my weapon is only the slingshot of David. He wrote that in 1885, before the Spanish-American War. So we're going to talk about 4 different possible responses of Latin America to a hegemonic power such as the United States. When I say hegemonic, I mean a world power that is a bit overwhelming for smaller nations of Latin America. The book uses the term imperialism, which I think is appropriate. The American empire is a reality, even though it may be neo-imperial. So, from the American Revolution through the wars of independence, there has existed a genuine sense of fraternal solidarity between North America and Latin America. Of course, when we say North America, I think the book is referring primarily to the United States. Technically, North America would include Mexico and Canada. We need a term for the United States besides America, because that originally and correctly applies to the entire Western Hemisphere. Perhaps I like a term in Spanish called Estado Unidenses. That would, in English, that would be United Statesians. There was a sense of fraternal solidarity before some incidents arose which tended to sour that relationship. The U.S. went on a quest for hemispheric domination from the 1830s to the 1930s, and this is what brought a strain on U.S.-Latin American relations. So what could Latin America do in response? What was possible and what was plausible? So here's 4 options that the book mentions. One would be to attempt to unify. This was the so-called Bolivarian Dream, referring to Simón Bolívar, who wanted a United States of Spanish America. You notice I said Spanish America. He was not a big fan of Brazil. So he was attempting to unite the Spanish republics. A second option is they could seek ties with European powers, and some of them did this. Argentina, for example, sought to develop its relationship with Great Britain. Brazil sought to develop a stronger relationship with the United States. Other countries established ties with France. A third option is they could seek to establish sub-regional hegemony. Again, this was attempted by Argentina and Brazil. As we'll see later in the notes, in the 1920s, Argentina was the seventh wealthiest country in the world. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a realistic chance that Argentina could become a counterbalance to the United States. The tragedy of the 1930s and the Great Depression came along and pretty much destroyed that hope. Brazil was another possible regional hegemon, and it continues to nourish that dream today. If you've heard talk about the BRIC countries, that would include Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and I believe South Africa are the emerging regional powers. So the fourth and last option is they could develop doctrines of international law to try to restrain the United States, and they did that, particularly several Chilean and Argentine theorists or intellectuals who were experts in international law. And here's a picture of an illustration of U.S. interventions in Latin America, 56 of them over 2 centuries. And you can see there it includes Guatemala, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Grenada, Venezuela, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Chile, and although there's not a box mentioning it, Mexico, obviously with the Mexican-American War and the expedition to try to find Pancho Villa in 1917. So this is why the Latin America is a bit leery of the United States. So let's talk about option one, the Bolivarian Dream. Of course, this was recently popularized again by Hugo Chavez and his dream of a Bolivarian revolution, trying to use Bolivar's vision to legitimize his own socialist revolution in Venezuela. And Bolivar's famous letter from Jamaica, written in 1815, Bolivar expressed a desire to forge Spanish America into one single new nation. It is a grandiose idea to think of consolidating the New World into a single nation, united by pacts into a single bond. How beautiful it would be if the Isthmus of Panama could be for us what the Isthmus of Corinth was for the Greeks. Bolivar envisioned Mexico plus Central America, La Gran Colombia, which included Venezuela and Ecuador and Panama, plus Bolivia and Peru and the southern South America as 3 regional federations. So instead of one United States of Spanish America, they would be the Greater Mexico, La Gran Colombia, and a southern cone with Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Chile. And these 3 federations would form a counterblock or counter influence to the United States. But it was not to be. Bolivar died disillusioned. Throughout the 1820s, there was a persistent fear that Spain would attempt to try to reinvade Latin America and regain its empire, I should say Spanish America. In 1834, Colombia was led by Bolivar and extended formal invitations to a conference to be held in Panama, which was then a Colombian province, for the purposes of establishing a Spanish-American Union. Only 4 nations attended: Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and the Central American Federation. Brazil and the United States were invited against Bolivar's objections, but to his relief, the Brazilians declined to attend, and the U.S. delegates were unable to arrive on time. The threat from Spain was declining, and the U.S. had not yet become a major threat. Bolivar wrote that Latin America was ungovernable, and that he who serves the revolution plows the sea. There were further attempts at unification in the 19th century. The U.S. went to war with Mexico, and as a result of the Mexican-American War, there was a greater sense of a common threat among Spanish-American nations, especially after the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine. Argentina's Juan Bautista Alberdi wrote in 1844, he called for an American Union to settle disputes. In 1847, in Lima, Peru, they hosted a second Latin American conference with delegates from Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. A third meeting took place in 1856, partly in reaction to filibusterer William Walker's interference in Nicaragua. The fourth meeting was in 1864, again in Lima, Peru, and it was in response to Spain's reconquering or retaking the Dominican Santo Domingo. It wasn't yet the Dominican Republic, but it took Santo Domingo and reincorporated it into the Spanish Empire. Spain also was at war with both Chile and Peru, and France was intervening in Mexico at the same time. So there was a sense of crisis. Although Spain and France were interfering in Latin America, the real sense of threat for the United States did not lessen. Francisco Bilbao in Chile wrote that the United States extends more each day the predatory hunt which it has already undertaken. We see fragments of America falling into the Saxon jaws of the voracious serpent. Yesterday, Texas, soon northern Mexico will accept a new sovereign. Feels odd to hear words like that, doesn't it, if you have not been exposed to any other history other than your own U.S. version of history. But it's a good thing. It's good to be stretched, and it's good to see a different point of view. The representatives attended from Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Peru, and Venezuela in this the fourth conference of Spanish-American republics. Brazil and Argentina wanted to maintain close ties to the European powers. They declined to attend. The United States was not invited. The Lima meeting of 1864 was the closest that Latin America had come to implementing Bolivar's exalted dream of Spanish-American unity. Obstacles included the historic rivalry between Argentina and Chile, and the ambivalence about the role of Brazil. Option number 2, external powers. Some Spanish-American leaders turned to alliances with European powers for protection. Simon Bolivar, for example, sought close ties with Great Britain. Great Britain dispatched a British observer to the Panama Congress. It also hid behind the Monroe Doctrine. In the end, Latin America was not important enough to Great Britain to merit risk. There was opposition to the Pan-Americanism. The U.S. began Pan-Americanism now refers not to the idea of a union of Spanish republics, but more of a Pan-American vision initiated and led by the United States. And this idea of Pan-Americanism was mistrusted in Latin America, where they believed that the United States was wanting to use this concept to manipulate the Spanish-American republics. So they resisted this, and they had apprehension about the rise of U.S. power. They resented the Monroe Doctrine, and they desired to maintain close ties with European allies. Jose Marti, the Cuban patriot, urged caution in 1889. Never in America from its independence to the present has there been a matter requiring more good judgment or vigilance than the invitation which the powerful United States is sending to the less powerful Latin American nations. Less powerful American nations. That's an important detail. The time has come for Spanish America to declare its second independence. American nations. The time has come for Spanish America to declare its second independence. Jose Marti. You can see why was popular after the Cuban Revolution in Cuba. Of course, he was popular before the Cuban Revolution as well. 1890, the Argentina representative Roque Sáenz Peña, a future president of Brazil, wrote, "What I lack is not love for America, but suspicion and ingratitude towards Europe. I cannot forget that in Europe are Spain, our mother, and Italy, our friend, and France, our elder sister. Instead of America for the Americans," he proclaimed, "the Congress should uphold the principle of America for all humanity." Condemnation of the Monroe Doctrine went along with the celebration of the European connection. The Pan American movement and the Monroe Doctrine were the twin symbols of U.S. preponderance. Keeping Europe out of the hemisphere meant keeping Latin America under U.S. control. Hispanidad and Francophilia. Another point of view similar to the Pax Britannica can be described as either Hispanidad or Francophilia. Hispanidad was a point of view that stressed the importance of Latin America's Spanish heritage, with its monarchism, Hispanic values, and traditional Catholicism. This view tended to be embraced by conservatives. An example was the Mexican Lucas Alemán and Uruguayan José Enrique Rodó. Francophilia, on the other hand, was a view of that put priority on France. There were also conservatives that were concerned about Spain's decline and weakness, preferring to find their monarchist values in Catholicism in a strong and more modern France. In 1856, a Colombian writer, Jose Maria Torres Caicedo, wrote a poem called The Two Americas. Before this time, let me point out there was a concept of one America, the Western Hemisphere, one continent. There were English speakers, Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers, but only one America. But with this poem in 1856 marks the beginning of an idea of two continents, or two Americas, one Latino and one Anglo. The Chilean politician Francisco Bilbao in Paris also coined the term Latin America. Both Caicedo and Bilbao used the term Latin America, which was an innovation. Before that time, it had been Spanish America, or America. Also, the French invasion of Mexico took place in 1861, lasted for 6 years, and as the French attempted to project themselves into Mexico and create a French empire, the term Latin America took on greater priority. Option number 3, rivalry and subregional hegemony. A third strategy for individual countries of Latin America was to try to compete with the United States. This strategy was unavailable for the small nations around the Caribbean basin or Mexico, which was dismembered in 1847. Only two nations could realistically hope to compete: Brazil and Argentina. Argentina saw itself as similar to the United States and therefore its rival. The winning of the U.S. West had its counterpart in Argentina's conquest of the desert and settlement of the Pampa, referred to as Nuestro Far West. Both the U.S. and Argentina received heavy immigration from Europe from 1870 to 1910. Domingo Sarmiento changed from being a Francophile to a fan of the U.S. He served as the minister of Argentina to Washington from 1865 to 68. By 1888, his attitude changed from one of admiration of the United States to rivalry. Some visitors predicted that Argentina would become a powerful rival to the U.S., and Argentine leaders looked upon Brazil with a mixture of fear and contempt. Part of the contempt was because of Brazil's large Afro-Brazilian population, something that Argentina had attempted to disguise by whitening its population through encouraging European immigration. In the 1920s, Argentina was ranked as the seventh richest country in the world, as well as one of the most democratic. God is a Brazilian. The other country to emulate the United States was Brazil. During the colonial period, love of land and a sense of natural majesty inspired a feeling of greatness. The sense of grandeza led to a common Brazilian saying that Deus é brasileiro. In contrast to Argentina, which sought alliances with European powers, Brazil sought to strengthen its relationship with the United States. The Baron of Rio Branco, a Brazilian diplomat, felt that the Spanish-American penchant for revolutions, dictators, and militarism showed Brazil's superiority. If you've taken a history course with me, you know that Brazil's route to independence was entirely different than the Spanish-American republics, and it enjoyed at least 60 years of monarchy after its independence, which allowed it to avoid some of the leadership vacuums and struggle over authority that Spanish-American countries had. Dreams of Brazilian grandeza foundered due to political instability, economic stagnation, persistent poverty. Nevertheless, dreams of Brazilian greatness continued even today due to vast natural and human resources. I just saw an article about record levels of destruction of the Amazon rainforest this past year. So that is a concern. Option number 4, doctrines and diplomacy. So this was the fourth alternative, to create protection under international law. A permanent court of international arbitration was established in 1899 at The Hague. In 1928, U.S. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and the French minister Aristide Briand formed a Pact of Paris, in which they proposed to outlaw the use of war as an instrument of national policy. Too bad they did not succeed. The doctrine of sovereign immunity from external invention was a part of the fruit of that work. Also, Andrés Bello of Chile and Carlos Calvo of Argentina were renowned thinkers on international relations who contributed to a growing body of thought about IR. They emphasized the absolute equality of all states, big or small. The Calvo Clause, aimed at the United States, asserted that business interests had to agree to allow the host country to handle legal disputes regarding financial investments. The Monroe Doctrine was still a factor, and it became even more important in 1902 to 3, when Venezuela was in debt to Great Britain, Germany, and Italy. They were threatening invasion or blocking its ports in order to forcibly collect its debt. And the Foreign Ministry of Argentina, Luis Maria Drago, appealed to Washington to intervene under the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, it was at this time Teddy Roosevelt was president that he articulated the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically emphasized that if there was a problem, a dispute between a European country and an American country, the United States would arbitrate, and if necessary, would do the forcible collection so that Europe would stay out. Howard Taft reemphasized this in 1907. In the 1930s, another Roosevelt was elected to the presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was known as Roosevelt the Good. I guess you can realize that the Teddy Roosevelt was Roosevelt the Bad, because of the difference in the way that they related to Latin America. Cultures of resistance. Smaller nations with enclave economies in the 1930s gave way to atrocious dictatorship. An enclave economy would be like the banana banana economy in Honduras, sugar in Cuba. These are smaller countries that are completely dependent on one agricultural product, and often the production of that product is owned by foreign capitalists who bring in their own people to manage these industries. Actually, industry is a poor choice of words. These plantation economies. That's an enclave economy. And Nicaragua, Honduras, um, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico were all enclave economies. During this time, during the 19th century, the U.S. interference in Latin America began with the U.S.-Mexican War, 1846. There was a growing problem between the U.S. and Cuba. Many Cubans uh, wanted to become part of the United States and become a state of the United States. Up through the Civil War, a lot of U.S. diplomats wanted to incorporate Cuba as a slave state. By the way, they also wanted to incorporate Nicaragua. Augusto Sandino was a a general and a guerrilla fighter in Nicaragua who refused to lay down his weapons so long as U.S. Marines were occupying Nicaragua, and he developed the first example of guerrilla warfare in the Americas. In the Mexican, U.S. Mexican, I've forgotten now what it was called, Mexican American War, U.S. Mexican War, was provoked when President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to the Mexican border to encroach upon sovereign Mexican territory and provoke a conflict. It was pretty deliberate. Polk was an expansionist. In 1846, he declared war in Mexico and sent General Winfield Scott to invade Mexico City. This led to a famous incident in the battle for Chapultepec, a high prominence in Mexico City, where young military cadets, basically teenagers, rather than surrender their flag, threw themselves off the cliff of Chapultepec, became immortalized as the Niños Héroes, heroes of Mexican history. Later on in the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa felt betrayed by the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and carried out a border raid in Columbus, New Mexico, and killed 18 Americans. Wilson responded by mobilizing 150,000 militia and 12,000 troops under General Black Jack Pershing, and invaded Mexico in search of Villa. The U.S. troops never found Villa and were defeated in a small combat in a town called Carrizal and took casualties and were forced to retreat from Mexico in embarrassment and ignominy. General Pershing was ordered to lead the retreat. He was shortly later to become the expeditionary leader of the U.S. Army to Europe for World War I. In order to protect business interests, the USA often sacrificed its ideals of self-determination and democracy. In Cuba, as the industry grew, the working class and unions grew in both power and strength. In Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, there were strong industrial growth, which involved the control of labor unions and the development of populist rhetoric to mobilize a new and powerful sector of modern society. In the 1930s, as a result, political forms changed, and you began to have authoritarian populist leaders like Vargas in Brazil and Cardenas in Mexico and Perón in Argentina. You might even also consider FDR in the United States as from this example. We began to see guerrilla warfare in El Salvador led by Farabundo Martí. There was a massacre of 30,000 peasants, leading to this guerrilla warfare and insurrection. In Nicaragua, I've already mentioned Augusto Cesar Sandino, who fought against U.S. Marines occupying his country. The Second World War brought relative prosperity to many Latin American nations and spurred economic growth. In 1933, FDR was elected president and brought the good neighbor policy along with him to develop a better relationship, more respectful relationship with Latin America, and promised not to intervene in other countries. The Cold War began in 1948, and this brought a whole different dynamic into U.S. relations with Latin America because everything became interpreted in terms of the Cold War. You're either with us or you're against us. In 1954, the U.S. CIA under Dulles, and the president was Eisenhower, engineered a regime change in Guatemala. The same year they did something similar in Iran. Both of these came back to haunt us, and this begins a long series of situations in which the United States is manipulating behind the scenes to bring down or topple democracies and place their own people in charge. I'd encourage you to watch some of the there's several documentaries about the overthrow of the Guatemalan democracy in 1954 that you should watch. The Cuban Revolution, the first Cuban Revolution, happened in 1933, and it was against Machado, and I can't remember his first name right now. Geraldo Machado, I believe it was. And then in that one, in 1933, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista rose to prominence, who later became a illegal dictator in 1953. And against him rose up Fidel Castro in the July 26 movement, which eventually resulted in the Cuban Revolution, along with an Argentinian Dr. Ernesto Guevara. The consequences of the Cuban Revolution: some democratic successors of past dictators radicalized their own discourse to gain hold of the supporters. An example is João Goulart in Brazil or Arturo Frondizi in Argentina. Some governments developed more radical foreign policy positions, the PRI in Mexico, for example. Some radical revolutionaries gained local and international support from invoking the Guatemala case. Oblivious to the real needs of Latin Americans and obsessed with its rivalry with the Soviet Union, the U.S. was caught entirely by surprise by the Cuban Revolution and by its broad support in the continent, even of middle-of-the-road nationalist Democrats. This is one reason why the Bay of Pigs failed so spectacularly, because the U.S. was completely unaware about how much support Fidel Castro had. In retrospect, Latin America did not have a middle-class consumer base, therefore could not develop manufacturing except for in a couple large countries like Argentina and Brazil. High population growth led to unemployment, and the economic solutions of the 1930s began to run out of steam by the 1950s. Democratic processes collapsed in most countries. Coups took place in El Salvador in 1962, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Argentina, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, and Chile. The Dominican Republic was also invaded by the U.S. Marines in 1965 under President Lyndon Johnson to eliminate a progressive coup. Costa Rica is one exception in all this. It underwent a social democratic revolution in 1948 that resulted in reform. It abolished its army and became the only uninterrupted functional democracy during the entire second half of the 20th century. Also, guerrilla movements emerged in every Latin American country, with the sole exception of Costa Rica. So they must have done something right. U.S. imperialism was a fact of life. It began in Mexico, but in the 20th century, it began with a coup in Hawaii in 1894, I believe it was, or maybe that's when Hawaii was accepted into the United States as another state. And the United States began its expansion looking for Navy bases. So Guantanamo, a Navy base in Hawaii, another Navy base, Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, a couple Navy bases. This was a result of an intention of developing a global Navy to project its power. And that concludes our quick overview of international relations in Latin America. I hope you'll read the chapter, maybe even read the book eventually. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.